Right, so enough of that jargon. It was all legal jargon, wasn't it? It was like reading a law book or something. So next, we're going off to Louis VII, surnamed the Young. And I have to remember, I am reading this. I'm not trying to decipher all history here for you. So it's just a reading of it. Okay, so back to 1137. Louis was in Guyenne when he received the news of his father's death. He immediately repaired to the capital, and on his way thither inflicted his exemplary punishment on the rebellious citizens of Orleans. When he arrived at Paris, he convened an assembly of the prelates and nobles, in which such effective measures were taken for repressing that spirit of sedition which was so frequent at the commencement of a reign, that the national tranquillity remained wholly undisturbed. In 38, the kingdom indeed had not enjoyed so perfect a calm as it now experienced for some time. This was principally owing to the fatal divisions which prevailed in Germany and England. The Emperor Henry V having died without heirs, the Germans, to the number of 60,000, assembled to appoint a successor. The Diet, being unable to come up to any conclusion, on account of the difference of opinion which obtained, chose 10 electors, who elected Lothair, Duke of Saxony. It is pretended that this election was influenced by Suger the monk, who is said to have been the first French minister that gave rise to civil wars in Germany. He repaired to Mayence with the retinue of a sovereign prince, and by a successful exertion of his talents for intrigue, succeeded in his efforts to promote the exclusion of Frederick, Duke of Swabia, who was nephew to the late emperor. That young prince, urged by ambition, was as well as resentment against France, protested against the elevation so formidable a rival. A bloody war ensued which lasted till the death of Lothair and the coronation of Conrad, brother to the Duke of Swabia. England and Normandy were equally convulsed on the death of Henry I and throne of England. It was usurped by Stephen, Count of Boulogne, nephew to Henry and brother to Thibaud, Count of Champagne, to the prejudice of Matilda and her infant son. The clergy profited, and profiting by the precarious situation of the usurper, annexed this condition to their oaths of allegiance, viz., that they were only bound to observe so long as the king defended the ecclesiastical liberties and supported the discipline of the church. The barons, in return for their submission, exacted terms of a still more pernicious tendency, equally destructive of public peace and of regal authority. Many of them insisted on the right of fortifying their castles and of putting themselves in a posture of defence, and the king found himself in no condition to withhold his consent from this exorbitant demand. The fatal effects of his compliance were soon visible. The whole kingdom was immediately filled with those fortresses, which the barons either garrisoned with their own vassals, or with licentious hirelings, who flocked to them from every quarter. The most shameful extortions were practised upon the people for the maintenance of these troops, and domestic feuds and private animosities now raged with unbounded violence, and rendered England a continued scene of riot and disorder. The nobles were constantly engaged in wars with each other. The barons even assumed the distinguishing marks of royalty, the right of coining money, and of exercising without appeal every act of jurisdiction, while the inferior gentry, as well as the common people, finding the laws inadequate to their defence. During this annihilation of sovereign power, were compelled for their own immediate safety to court the protection of some neighbouring chieftain by consenting to submit to his exactions, and to assist him in his rapine upon others. The erection of one castle caused the building of another, and even those who had not obtained the king's permission thought that they were entitled, by the grand principle of self-preservation, to put themselves on a footing with their neighbours, who were generally their enemies and rivals. These cruel disorders which prevailed in the neighbouring states were favourable to the tranquillity of France, which was at this time agitated only by theological disputes that were not carried to a sufficient height or to disturb the national repose. So, France was at peace, but England was not. Abelard, though he had been compelled to burn his book upon the Trinity, still persevered in the same sentiments which he had there promulgated. He consequently continued to teach the same doctrine, and even ventured to probate in his writings many bold propositions, which hitherto he had contented himself with explaining to his pupils. Bernard, abbot of Clairvaux, in the county of Champagne, instigated by William, abbot of Theory, accused him of following the example of Arius in making distinctions between the three persons of the Trinity, of imitating Pelagius in preferring free will to grace, and of agreeing with Nestorius in dividing the person of Christ. A council was accordingly assembled at Sens for the purpose of taking these charges into consideration, at which the king and the Count of Champagne were both present. The abbot of Clairvaux opened the business of the day and displayed a fund of eloquence that seduced his audience. By the applause which he received from the assembly, Abelard was convinced that his condemnation would be pronounced. The embarrassment occasioned by this idea almost deprived him of the use of his facilities. It did not, however, prevent him from thinking of his personal safety by making an appeal to the Pope. The council, therefore, though they proceeded to condemn his doctrine, were prevented from inflicting any punishment on him. Abelard set out for Rome in order to pursue his appeal and to justify himself to the sovereign pontiff. But the abbot of Cluny prevented him from proceeding, and undertook to reconcile him to Bernard, Then the face of affairs totally changed, and the doctrine of Abelard was no longer called into question. He died 2 years after this reconciliation, overwhelmed with infirmities. He was doubtless the brightest genius of the age in which he lived. His misfortunes were owing to an excess of sensibility, and to the splendor of his reputation. His wife, Heloise, survived him near 20 years, and at her death was interred at the same tomb with her husband at the Abbey of Paraclet, which she had founded. In 1140, such was the state of France, when the king was led into a quarrel with the Pope on the election of a prelate to the see of Bourg, on the death of Alberic. The chapter of Bourg had elected, without waiting the approbation of their sovereign, Peter de la Châtre, a man of illustrious birth, to the vacant archiepiscopal see. The indignant monarch, determined to vindicate his insulted authority, commanded the chapter to proceed to a new election, but the clergy firmly maintained their choice. The Roman pontiff espoused the cause of Pierre de la Châtre, observing that the king was a young man who stood in need of instruction and should be taught not to accustom himself to familiar attempts. An observation equally indiscreet and indecent in a prelate who was indebted for his elevation to the protection afforded him by France against the faction of Anaclet. The new archbishop, fortified by the suffrage of the court of Rome, hastened to take possession of his diocese, but the inhabitants of Bourges, faithful to the orders of their sovereign, refused him admission into their city. He was therefore constrained to take refuge with the Count of Champagne, under whose protection he launched the thunders of the Church against that part of the royal domain which was comprised within the limits of his archbishopric. The torch of discord was kindled by this hasty spark, and the destructive flame was fed by another incident, which equally displayed the dangerous and encroaching spirit of the court of Rome, nourished the arrogance of the Count of Champagne, and provoked the resentment of the King of France. In 1141 and 1142, Rodolphe, Count of Vermandois, who had successfully presided over the council of Louis and his father, had divorced from his bed on the Commons the convenient plea of consanguinity. His wife, the near relation of the Count of Champagne, and had espoused Petronilla, the daughter of the late Duke of Aquitaine, and the younger sister of Eleonora, Queen of France. The mind of Theobald was deeply wounded by the indignity offered to his family. The Roman pontiff readily embraced the cause of the protector of Pierre de la Châtre. He declared the marriage of Petronilla void, and denounced the penalty of excommunication against Rodolphe, unless he, reinterested in the fate of his kinsmen, was not to be dismayed by the terror of spiritual censure. With a formidable army, he entered the territories of Thebaid and compelled a haughty chief to sue for peace. As the means of obtaining it, he promised to intercede with the Pope to revoke the excommunication of the Count de Vermandois and the interdict which Pierre de la Châtre had pronounced against the royal domain in the Archbishopric of Bourg. Yet the king had no sooner retired within his own dominions than he was again assailed by the hostile weapons of the apostolic chair and enraged at the deceit of Thebaid, the sincerity of whose submission he justly suspected. He determined to avenge on the innocent inhabitants of Champagne the perfidy of their turbulent prince. He laid waste the country with indiscriminate rage, and having taken the town of Vitry by surprise, set fire to the parish church in which 1,300 persons had taken refuge, all of whom miserably perished in the flames. But shame and repentance soon succeeded those emotions of youthful rage and impetuous resentment, which had urged the youthful mind of Louis to the commission of so inhuman a deed. Impressed with the deepest sentiments of remorse, he reconciled himself to the Count of Champagne, acknowledged Pierre as the Archbishop of Bourg, and made a vow to undertake an expedition to Palestine, which in those days was deemed a sufficient expiation of the most enormous crimes. In 1145 and in 1144, the distress of the Christian warriors in Palestine called for immediate assistance from Europe, and the falling fortunes of the Latins could only be propped by, they didn't say propped up, but then they say propped by the immense preparations for the Second Crusade. The city of Edessa had been recovered from the Christians by the valor of Zhang He, a Turkish chief, who ruled with independent authority the Asiatic kingdoms of Aleppo and Mosul. So he had those both. And the conquest which had been achieved by the father was protected by the same and fortune of the son. The name of Noureddin, the Light, still gleams through the darkness of Asiatic history, and its meridian glory eclipsed the saint lustre of the unworthy successors at Godfrey. The throne of Jerusalem was then proclaimed by the inexperienced youth of Baldwin III, whose tender years were protected by the counsels of his mother, Melisenda, while the principalities of Antioch and Tripoli obeyed the authority of the two Raymonds, Counts of Poitiers and Toulouse. Bernard, who had been employed to preach this second crusade, and whose servant eloquence had aroused the fanatical zeal of the Germans and Flemings, was earnest in his exhortations to Louis to fulfill with speed the solemn vow he had made. Suger, abbot of Saint-Denis, on the contrary, exerted his utmost efforts to dissuade the king from an enterprise from which there was everything to fear and nothing to hope, and which he might effectually assist by a contribution of men and money, while his presence was requisite at home to secure the tranquillity of his hereditary dominions. The king's esteem was so equally divided between these two ecclesiastics that he long hesitated between the different counsels, which they with equal eagerness enforced. They are both indeed represented by historians as worthy of his confidence by the extent of their merit. The first had, rather by a reputation for sanctity, richly deserved and fully confirmed, than for any solidity of understanding or brilliancy of wit ensured, a respect and consideration for his person, which having frequently more weight than authority itself, the last by a superiority of genius strengthened by comprehensive talents and incorruptible probity, had acquired that degree of public confidence which does honour even to virtue. The abbot of Clairvaux, with the air and enthusiasm of a prophet, had a prophet's inflexibility. The abbot of Saint Denis, with a greater knowledge of the world, was more modest in his address, more insinuating in his manners, and his firmness was never carried to extremes. They were alike directed by important views, though to a different nature. Bernard was earnest in his endeavours to promote exclusively the interests of religion, at least what he deemed such, whereas Suger, exempt from fanaticism, though rationally devout, wished to make the prosperity of the Church coincide with the welfare of the state. But the enthusiasm of the prophet overcame the wisdom of the politician, and Louis, stricken with remorse for his cruelty at Vitry, determined to assume the cross and repair to Palestine. A parliament was accordingly assembled at Vézelay in 1146 in Burgundy, and it was so numerously attended that no building was found sufficiently spacious to contain the members, who therefore met in an open field. The eloquence of Bernard was here successfully employed, who depicted in glowing colours the meritorious piety and the internal rewards which attended the holy warfare. The king received from his hands a cross which the Pope had sent him from Rome, and his example was followed by the Queen and a numerous train of nobles, prelates, and gentlemen of inferior quality. The holy infection soon passed from these to the people, and the cross. No, they're saying the cross. All right. Yes, resounded on every side. Such was the enthusiastic ardour to engage in this pious enterprise that the towns and villages were so far stripped of their inhabitants that in many of them none but women and children were left behind. It seemed as if in the French, disguised with the rich country with which ancestors had conquered, were desirous of seeking a new establishment in a different quarter of the globe. A spindle and, I don't know, distaff, distaff, a spindle and distaff were sent, it might be to do with weaving, was sent to all who had the ability to join the Crusaders, but who wanted the will, even the women, even the women were ambitious to assume the cross, and the generality of wives followed their husbands in this long and dangerous pilgrimage. In 1147, the forces which assembled under Oriflamme of Saint-Denis have been computed at more than 200,000 men. The reign of government were, during the absence of the king, entrusted to Rodolphe, Count of Vermandois, and to Suger, Abbot of Saint-Denis, whose counsels he had rejected, but whose prudence and judgment he esteemed. At the head of this unwieldy host, Louis traversed successfully the plains of Hungary and encamped under the walls of Constantinople, where he was received with all the possible honors by the Emperor Manuel Comnenus. That prince was, in the flower of his youth, possessed of every personal accomplishment, endued with prudence superior to his years, with seducing eloquence and inflexible courage. But these, unjustly observed by a modern historian, that the court of the more early Greek emperors seems to have resembled those of Eastern monarchs, both in magnificence and in corruption of manners. Manuel Comnenus rioted in every kind of luxury, and wantoned in every species of debauchery. He openly shared his bed with his mother, the Princess Theodora. He supported his vices with such excess of prodigality that his subjects were overwhelmed with the most oppressive imports, and well-earned fruits of their industry and labor were applied to gratify the insatiate avidity of his eunuchs and of the base ministers of his guilty pleasures. Perfidious in the extreme, while he loaded the Crusaders with caresses, he left no artifice unemployed to promote their destruction. He had this portrait of the emperor been drawn by a French or by a German writer, we might have been tempted to call it the justice in question, and to have suspected that the features had been disguised by prejudice and partiality. But as it comes from the pencil of Nesitas Choniatas, a Greek writer contemporary with Manuel, we can have no reason to doubt its truth, particularly as, far from being partial to the Crusaders, he inveighs against them with extreme violence. Speaking of the Franks, he describes them as barbarians, fierce, illiterate, impetuous, and savage, and he gives an account of the ferocity and devastations of the Crusaders in general, in terms not unlike those which preceding historians had employed in describing the incursions of the Goths and the Vandals. From the same author we learn that Manuel assigned guides to the Crusaders, who were privately instructed by the emperor himself to lead them into défilé, where they were attacked by troops stationed for that purpose, that he caused the gates of all the towns in his dominions to be oh my gosh, fought against them, shut against them. The doors, did he just not say the doors of all the towns? The gates to be shut. So it sounds like the towns themselves had gates. And yes, and they stood behind those to fight when need be. And they could obtain no provisions. So till they had, because inside the provisions, well, I guess, till they had previously deposited their money in baskets let down from the walls to receive it, by which means they were exposed to incessant impositions, as the Greeks frequently disappeared with the cash and brought them nothing in return. So they would put the money in a basket and they would never give them even an apple. All right. Okay, where are we? Nothing in return. That lime mixed in the flour distributed to the troops, which proved destruction of thousands. So, lime, I guess they really do mean lime, like building construction lime was literally mixed into the flour for the troops when they made the bread, which proved the destructions of thousands. That the natives had fabricated a base coin with which they always paid the Crusaders whenever they purchased anything from them and refused to take it in payment for their own articles. That there was no wicked artifice, in short, which the emperor did not employ, or cause to be employed against them, to serve as an example to their descendants, that might deter them from entering on the Greek territories. In 1148, but during the stay of Louis at the court of Constantinople, he experienced from the artful emperor every mark of respect, friendship, and esteem. The French monarch, ever mindful of his own dignity, refused to grant precedency to the Greek, but preserved on all occasions a perfect equality. Of this becoming jealousy, a striking instance is mentioned by Odo de Duil, a monk of Saint Denis, who was secretary, not secretly doing anything, he was secretary and chaplain to the king. He had already passed the Bosphorus with his army, when he received a message from Manuel, desiring a conference at Constantinople. But Louis sent him word that if he had anything to communicate, it must either come to him or at least meet him halfway on the sea, that they might treat on equal terms, a proposal with which the governor found himself obliged to comply. So it sounds like they did have some boats, because it said meet him halfway on the sea. At Nice, Louis met Conrad, Emperor of Germany, his rival in the pious warfare, returning wounded from a glorious but unfortunate combat in the défilé of Monte Taurus, into which he had been betrayed by the perfidy of Manuel, and seeking for some vessels to carry him to Palestine by sea. There we go. Now we are getting to boats by the sea. So it sounds like he didn't have them now, but he would buy them along the way. The King of France, however, unwarned by his misfortunes, pressed forwards to the banks of Meander, which he passed in sight of the Turks. Meander, whom he afterwards attacked in their camp and defeated. with great slaughter. But in a few days he experienced a reverse of fortune, and by the negligence of his officers was exposed to an attack that had nearly proved fatal to his cause. It was an established rule in the French army that 2 of the principal nobles should command, alternatively, the van and the rear guards, and fix on the ground where the troops should encamp. Geoffrey de Rançon, a powerful baron of Poitou, led the van that day, carrying the royal standard, and preceded by the oriflamme of Saint-Denis. It had been settled that he should fix his camp on the summit of a mountain in order to command the défilé, but finding neither forage nor water at the destined spot, he descended into a pleasant vale at the foot of the hill. The Turks, taking advantage of this important step, attacked the rear guard with such impetuous fury that the first rank was broken in an instant. The second displayed greater firmness, but oppressed with numbers and overcome with surprise, the whole army must inevitably have been destroyed but for the friendly intervention of night. The king was retiring with precipitation after having signalized his valor in the field, when his golden spurs attracted the notice of a band of Saracens, who resolved to seize the glittering prize. They accordingly pursued Louis, who, unable to effect his escape, placed his back against a large tree, where he defended himself with such vigor against his numerous assailants that he had soon an opportunity of climbing to the top. The Saracens plied him with their arrows, but were unable to penetrate his armor. They next attempted to ascend the tree, but the king used his saber with such skill and success that, ignorant of his quality and intimidated by the opposition they experienced, they at length left him in search of plunder that could be acquired with greater facility. He then left his post and mounting a stray horse, was lucky enough to find the défilé of the mountain, and to attain the camp of his vanguard, who, having recovered their sovereign, whom they imagined to be killed or taken, consoled themselves for the loss of 1/2 of the army. After this disaster, and it was a disaster, wasn't it? Lose 1/2 of your army. Well, but Louis, he has bad mojo for what he did in that church, and all those people, remember? Okay, Louis proceeded to the small seaport of Atalia, on the coast of Pamphylia, where he procured vessels to convey himself and a part of his troops to Antioch. There he was received with kindness and distinction by his uncle, Raymond of Poitiers. But to public calamity succeeded the pangs of domestic misery. The charms of his wife had made a deep impression on the Prince of Antioch, and Eleonora, frail as she was fair, returned the affection of her kinsman, and basely dishonored her lord and sovereign. Indeed, she was prodigal of her favors. A youthful Turk named Saladin loaded her with presents and received her caresses in return. the warmth of her passions overcame the dictates of honor, and she suffered her beauteous person to be polluted by the promiscuous embraces of her numerous admirers. From Antioch, Louis, accompanied by his reluctant queen, set sail for Jerusalem, where he was joined by the Emperor Conrad. Reinforced by the troops of Baldwin III, King of Jerusalem, they determined to form the siege of Damascus, and that city was strong both by art and nature. But the vigorous attacks of the Christians overcame every obstacle, and their efforts must have been finally crowned with success had not the jealousies that prevailed among themselves proved more fatal than the arms of their enemies. The report that the Damascus, when reduced, was to be given to the Count of Flanders, disgusted the Christians who were established in Syria and induced by envy. Gosh, I should read this all over. I really buggered this one up. Disgusted the Christians who were established in Syria and induced by envy to betray the cause in which they had embarked. They maintained a secret correspondence with the Turks, in conference of which the convoys were surprised. The works were insulted, and Conrad and Louis were at length compelled to relinquish the hopeless enterprise, and, having given sufficient proofs of their piety and courage, they embarked at a port in Syria, and returned to their respective dominions. The French, in the meantime, bewailed with bitter lamentations the misguided zeal of their monarch and the fatal effects of an expedition that had drained the kingdom of its wealth and greatly diminished the number of its inhabitants. But the abbot of Clairvaux was the chief object of their indignation. They accused him of being a false prophet, and censured him loudly for interfering in matters that did not concern him, instead of confining him to the duties of his station. The widow and the orphan reproached him with their losses, with the splendor of his promises and the magnitude of their disappointment. In vain did he attempt to justify himself by the example of Moses, who, like him, had promised the children of Israel, on the part of the Lord, to conduct them into a land of blessing, and who saw the first generation perish in the deserts. Okay. Like them, he observed the Crusaders had by their own abominations forged the thunder that destroyed them. But the grief of the people was too poignant to bear with remonstrance where they expected excuse, and the eloquence of Bernard, having, once so fatally deceived them, had now lost its wonted effect. But while the ears of Bernard were thus assailed by the curses of his countrymen, all France was unanimous in bestowing its benedictions on the abbot of Saint-Denis, who had governed the state during the absence of his sovereign, with a degree of wisdom and prudence that merited the highest commendations. in 1150 to 1152, Louis, on his return from Palestine, found the flames of civil war raging in England and Normandy, where the pretenders of the sovereignty asserted their separate claims with equal vigour, though not with equal success. Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, and his son Henry Plantagenet repaired to his court. We should say it French. Henri Plantagenet repaired to his court and claimed his protection against a usurper who had deprived them of their lawful inheritance. Policy coinciding with justice, the king listened to their suit and, having resolved to espouse their cause, raised a powerful army with which he invaded Normandy, and, having reduced that duchy, resigned it to Prince Henry, who paid him homage for it, and as a reward for a service so important ceded to him that district of country which lies between the rivers Epte and Andelle, and is distinguished by the appellation of the Vexin Normand. The Count of Anjou died soon after, leaving 3 sons: Henry, who succeeded to his dominions, Geoffrey, to whom he bequeathed Chinon, and Loudon and Mirabeau, and William, who was invested with the county of Mortagne. Nor was it long before the king experienced a more severe loss. In the death of his 2 virtuous ministers, Rodolphe, Count of Vermandois, and Suger, Abbot of Saint-Genis, and these were soon followed by the pious enthusiast Saint Bernard, who during his life had founded no less than 77 convents of his own order, 35 in France, 11 in Spain, 6 in the Low Countries, 5 in England, 5 in Ireland, 5 in Savoy, 4 in Italy, 2 in Germany, 2 in Sweden, and one in Hungary and 1 in Denmark. And these abbeys had given rise to as many more in the different countries in which they were situated. It's a lot of convents. All right, now we have the coolness that had subsided. The coolness, they actually use that term. That's very interesting, the breeze of each other. They were just cool. The coolness that had subsisted between the king and queen ever since the discovery of Eleonora's infidelity at Antioch daily increased, and the contrariety of their dispositions at length produced so dreadful an antipathy between them that they were unable to support each other's company. Louis lamented in secret the licentious conduct of a wife who neither respected his rank nor person, while the queen affected to bewail the cruelty of her own fate in having married a prince who was better adapted to a cloister than a throne. When they were thus mutually prepared for a separation, a divorce was resolved on, but the king, though deeply offended, was willing to spare the reputation of his wife, and instead of founding his pretensions on her adulterous behaviour, caused her relations to prefer the more honourable and convenient plea of consanguinity. Yeah, you didn't want to say she was adulteress out there to all the people. This being examined by a council assembled at Beaugency, was declared to be valid, and the sentence of divorce was accordingly pronounced. With Eleonora, Louis restored her ample inheritance, the fertile and important counties of Guyenne and Poitou, though his conduct in thus easily parting with these wealthy provinces, this had been loudly censured by historians as impolite and unwife. It was certainly dictated by honour and sanctioned by justice. Oh, not unwife, unwise. So in thus easily parting with these wealthy provinces, it was loudly censored by historians. And they called it impolite, impolitique, and unwise. Impolitique might not be impolite, might just be impolitique. Eleonora was no sooner at liberty than she was addressed by a variety of suitors, whom the charms of her person and the extent of her possessions induced to overlook the defects of her mind and the frailty of her conduct. Those who, from their birth and pretensions, had the fairest prospect of success were Theobald, Count of Chartres and Boulois, Geoffrey, Count of Chinon, and his brother Henri Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou. The two first, despairing of success, formally separate plans for taking off the princess by force on her road to Guyenne. But she had the good fortune to escape the snares that were laid for her, and to reach her own dominions in perfect safety. The moment she arrived there, she dispatched a faithful messenger to the Duke of Normandy, with the offer of her hand and fortune. The alliance was equally suitable to both parties. It gave to Henry the finest duchy in France, while it secured to Eleonora, to use the words of the Reverend Father Daniel, a prince in the bloom of youth, full of fire, gallant, brave, and vigorous, equally capable of defending her dominions and satisfying her desires. Henri accordingly accepted with joy the proffered prize, and heedless of those imperfections in his bride which it is probable either his vanity or his ambition taught him to overlook, hastened to the completion of that ceremony which put him in full possession of the person and domains of Eleonora, within 6 weeks after her divorce from King Louis. I'm going to stop there.